The desert does not forgive. It does not forget. It simply waits. If you stand today in the remote province of Middle Egypt, about halfway between Cairo and Luxor, you will feel it. The silence here is heavy, pressing down on your chest like a physical weight. The sun beats down mercilessly on the crumbling limestone foundations of what was once the most magnificent, controversial city in the ancient world. To the casual observer, there is nothing here but wind, sand, and the broken teeth of ancient walls jutting from the earth. But look closer. Beneath centuries of accumulated dust lies the evidence of a scandal so horrific, so visceral, that ancient Egypt tried to scrub it from existence entirely. This is not just a ruin. It is a crime scene. The man responsible for this desolation was systematically removed from every monument. His name was chiseled away with such fury that, even today, the very stones seem to scream with the violence of their defacement. His name was Akhenaten. For centuries, historians called him the heretic king, a misunderstood visionary who introduced monotheism to a polytheistic world. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at destruction. As we peel back the layers of propaganda and time, a much darker reality begins to bleed through. What we have uncovered about Akhenaten and the unspeakable acts he committed against his own flesh and blood represents one of history's most disturbing examples of absolute power corrupting absolutely. This isn't just another tale of royal excess or political intrigue. This is the story of a man who transformed his own children into instruments of his twisted ambition, sacrificing their innocence and their humanity on the altar of his megalomaniacal vision. To understand the horror, we must first understand the beauty that was lost. The nightmare began, as nightmares often do, in a time of unprecedented light. We have to go back to Thebes, the beating heart of the Egyptian Empire. This was the height of the 18th dynasty. The Nile's life-giving waters reflected the glory of a civilization at its peak. Gold flowed into Egypt like water, the granaries were full, and the gods were content. In the golden halls of Thebes, 6 daughters were born to a couple that appeared to be the very image of royal perfection. Their names rang like poetry through the cool, incense-scented corridors of the palace: Maritaten, Meketaten, Nkesinemen, Neferneferutin Tasherit, Neferneferer, and Setapenra. Each princess carried within her name a blessing, a prayer to the gods for her prosperity and happiness. Maritaten, beloved of the Aten. Meketaten, behold the Aten. They were the darlings of the empire. Their father, who began his reign as Amenhotep IV before shedding that skin to become Akhenaten, seemed devoted to his family in those early years. The art from this period is shocking in its intimacy. For the first time in Egyptian history, palace walls were decorated not with scenes of the pharaoh smiting enemies or communing with distant gods, but with scenes of domestic bliss. These images were revolutionary. They depicted the pharaoh not as a remote, stone-faced deity, but as a loving father. We see him bouncing his daughters on his knees. We see him kissing them. We see the royal children playing beneath the benevolent rays of the sun god, the Aten. To the people of Egypt, this must have looked like a golden age of family values. But something dark was stir. Ring beneath this facade of familial perfection. A shadow was growing in the mind of the pharaoh. Akhenaten's religious obsessions were growing more intense, more consuming with each passing year. His fixation on the sun disk, the Aten, was transforming from simple devotion into a dangerous, all-consuming fanaticism. He began to see himself not merely as the god's chosen representative, but as the sole conduit through which divine will could be expressed on earth. In the temples of Karnak, the priests of Ammonius the Old, hidden God watched with growing unease. They saw a king who was drifting away from the traditions that had kept the universe in balance for 1,000 years. They saw a man who stared too long at the sun. This theological megalomania would prove catastrophic for his daughters, though they could not have understood the shadow falling across their childhood paradise. While they played their innocent games and received their education in the arts befitting royal princesses, their father was laying the groundwork for a revolution that would ultimately consume their lives in ways too terrible for civilized minds to contemplate. The turning point, the moment the trap began to close, came in the 5th year of his reign. Akhenaten made a fateful decision. He declared that Thebes, with its old gods and powerful priests, was unclean. He would abandon the religious capital entirely. He would build a new city, a virgin city dedicated solely to his god, on a patch of desert where no god had ever been worshipped before. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. We know it today as Amarna. Imagine the scene. Thousands of workers, dragged from their homes, forced to toil under the blistering sun to raise a metropolis from the dust in record time. Speed was everything. Quality was secondary. It was a city built on broken backs and religious hysteria. And for the royal daughters, this move marked the beginning of their nightmare. They were uprooted from the luxurious, stable environment of Thebes and transported to this isolated construction site in the middle of nowhere. Amarna was a golden cage. It was a city populated entirely by their father's sycophants, his fanatical followers, and those who were too terrified to say no. Cut off from the stabilizing influence of the traditional court, isolated in a city that was essentially a cult compound, the young princesses found themselves trapped. The palace walls that had once seemed protective now felt suffocating. The constant religious ceremonies that dominated daily life became an oppressive routine that allowed no escape from their father's increasingly erratic behavior. But the true horror was yet to come. As the city rose, the art changed. And this is where the story takes a turn into the grotesque. The depictions of the royal family grew stranger, more unsettling. The princesses were no longer shown as idealized Egyptian beauties. They were shown with elongated skulls, distended bellies, and slack jaws. Historians have argued for decades about this art. Was it a stylistic choice? A rebellion against tradition? Or was it a brutally honest depiction of a family riddled with genetic deformities caused by generations of inbreeding? Whatever the cause, the message was clear: the royal family was different. They were not like other humans. They were alien, divine, separate. In Akhenaten's theology, he and his family were the only beings who mattered. The traditional gods were dead. The priesthood was scattered. The only way to reach the divine was through the Pharaoh and his family. His identity subsumed theirs. They were shown not as individual children, but as extensions of his divine essence. Then, the crisis of legitimacy hit. Akhenaten had rejected the ancient gods. He had severed the cords of tradition. Foreign allies were beginning to question Egypt's stability under this radical ruler who ignored diplomatic letters and spent his days writing hymns to the sun. The Hittites to the north were watching, waiting for weakness. In this atmosphere of paranoia and isolation, Akhenaten turned to the most disturbing solution imaginable. He needed to secure his line. He needed to concentrate sacred power within his immediate family. He needed to create a theology so pure, so concentrated, that it required means that violated every norm of human decency. He would use his own daughters to create a new form of divine kingship. The first signs appeared in subtle changes to palace protocol. The eldest daughter, Akhenaten, began appearing in ceremonies typically reserved for the queen, Nefertiti. At first, the court whispered that perhaps it was merely ceremonial a way to honor a beloved daughter or prepare her for a future marriage to a foreign prince. But as months passed, the nature of her elevated status became increasingly clear and increasingly disturbing. Palace artists were commissioned to create reliefs showing Akhenaten in positions that left no doubt about her new role. She stood beside her father during religious ceremonies, not as a daughter supporting her parent, but as a consort supporting her husband. The iconography was unmistakable to anyone familiar with Egyptian royal symbolism. This young woman, barely into her teens, was being prepared for a fate that would have horrified even the most jaded courtiers of that decadent age. The psychological manipulation required to accomplish this transformation must have been extraordinary. You have to understand the environment these girls grew up in. Akhenaten had spent years conditioning his daughters to see him as more than merely their father. In his theological system, he was the earthly embodiment of the Aten. His word was literally sacred law. To disobey him was not merely rebellion against paternal authority, it was blasphemy. It was a strike against the cosmic order itself. This religious conditioning provided the framework, but it could not mask the fundamental wrongness of what Akhenaten was planning. The palace servants whispered in horror about the ceremonies they were forced to witness. Foreign diplomats sent increasingly disturbed reports back to their home courts. Even the fanatical followers who had abandoned everything to follow their pharaoh to his desert capital began to express private doubts. Meanwhile, the other princesses watched in growing terror as their eldest sister's fate became clear. They could see their own futures written in Meritaten's glazed eyes and mechanical smiles. The loving father who had once delighted in their childhood games had become something monstrous, a creature whose need for theological validation had consumed any remnant of natural human feeling. And where was the mother? Where was Nefertiti? The tragedy deepened when the great royal wife, the woman whose beauty was legendary, mysteriously began to fade from the historical record. For years, she had been her husband's partner in this revolution. She had been depicted as mighty enemies, worshipping the sun, standing as his equal. And then silence. Whether she died, was exiled, or simply retreated into obscurity to escape the horror of what her husband had become, her absence was catastrophic. It left the princesses completely vulnerable. The one person who might have protected them, who might have stood between the madness of the king and the innocence of her children, was gone. As Meritaten's formal elevation to queenship approached, the psychological damage inflicted on the royal family became impossible to hide. Palace physicians were called in to treat various members of the household for what ancient records describe as ailments of the mind and spirit. The preparations for the ceremony that would formalize Meritaten's new status proceeded with all the pomp and grandeur Akhenaten could muster. Golden ornaments were crafted. Precious stones were set into ceremonial regalia. The finest artists in the kingdom were commissioned to create monuments celebrating this unholy union. But beneath the surface magnificence lay a rot so profound that it would ultimately destroy not just the individuals involved, but the entire dynasty. The ceremony took place on a day when the desert winds carried whispers of unease throughout the capital. Ancient texts describe preparations that lasted for weeks, with craftsmen working around the clock. They were creating symbols of a sacred marriage for a union that represented the corruption of everything those symbols stood for. Imagine the psychological terror inflicted on Meritaten during this period. She was barely 15 years old. She had grown up believing her father loved her. Now, she discovered that his affection had twisted into something unspeakably dark. The young woman who had once danced freely in the palace gardens now moved through the corridors like a ghost. Her eyes were vacant, her spirit already broken by the weight of expectation. But Akhenaten's perversions did not end with his eldest daughter. As the months passed and it became clear that Meritaten had not immediately produced the male heir he desperately needed, the pharaoh's attention turned to his second daughter, Meketaten. This young girl, who could not have been more than 13, suddenly found herself thrust into the same nightmare that had consumed her sister. The pattern established with Meritaten repeated itself with horrifying precision. Palace artists were again commissioned to create reliefs showing the new arrangement, their hands trembling as they carved images that violated every principle of decent human behavior. Meketaten began appearing in ceremonies wearing the regalia of queenship, standing beside her father in poses that made their new relationship unmistakably clear. The psychological manipulation required to accomplish these successive transformations reveals the depths of Akhenaten's depravity. He had created an environment where his daughters had no choice but to comply. Resistance was unthinkable. The religious framework he had constructed made questioning his will equivalent to questioning divine authority itself. Contemporary accounts from palace servants, preserved in fragments of papyrus that survived the later attempts at destruction, describe scenes that haunt the imagination. They speak of young women who move through their daily routines like sleepwalkers, their personalities fractured by trauma too severe for their minds to process. They describe ceremonies where these broken girls performed their roles as queens with mechanical precision, while their eyes stared into some distant horror that only they could see. The medical consequences of these arrangements soon became apparent. Palace physicians were summoned repeatedly to treat conditions that the surviving medical papyri describe in euphemistic language, but their meaning is clear enough to modern understanding. These young women were suffering physical trauma that reflected the unnatural nature of their relationships. The tragedy reached its most horrific crescendo when Meketaten died. The official records speak vaguely of illness, perhaps a plague that was sweeping through the region. But the artistic evidence tells a different, far more devastating story. Reliefs carved in the royal tomb show scenes of intense mourning. We see the royal family weeping, their grief raw and unstylized. But look at the center of the scene. We see a young woman lying on what appears to be a birthing bed. She is attended by midwives. Nearby, a wet nurse holds a newborn infant. The implications of this imagery are inescapable. Akhenaten died in childbirth. And given the isolation of the royal family, given the elevation of her status, the father of that child was almost certainly Akhenaten himself. The girl who should have been playing with dolls, who should have been learning the arts appropriate to a princess, had instead died bringing her father's offspring into a world that offered no hope of normalcy. The death of Akhenaten sent shockwaves through what remained of the royal court. Even the most fanatical supporters of Akhenaten's religious revolution found themselves questioning a system that could produce such monstrous results. Whispered conversations in palace corridors spoke of divine judgment, of cosmic retribution for violations so profound that they had disrupted the very order of creation. But rather than recognizing the horror of what he had done, Akhenaten responded to his daughter's death with even more desperate measures. His need for male heirs to continue his revolutionary dynasty had become an obsession that consumed whatever remained of his humanity. The surviving daughters watched their sister's funeral preparations with the terrible knowledge that her death had not ended their nightmare. It had only intensified their father's determination. The youngest of the older trio, Akhenaten, now found herself in the crosshairs. This child, whose name meant she lives for Ammonius, before she was forced to change it to Akhenaten, she lives for the Aten, would indeed live for her father's god in ways that represented the ultimate perversion of devotion. She watched Akhenaten die. She saw what the honor of being her father's wife brought. And now, the eyes of the pharaoh turned to her. Palace records from this period paint a picture of a court where normal human relationships had completely broken down. Servants were afraid to look directly at the royal family, not out of traditional respect, but because the sight of what these young women had become was too disturbing to bear. Foreign ambassadors sent reports home describing a pharaoh who had clearly lost his mind, and a royal household that had descended into a hell of his own making. The psychological damage extended beyond the immediate victims to encompass the entire royal household. The remaining daughters Neferneferutin Tasheret, Neferneferur, and Setapenra were still children. Where these broken girls performed their roles as queens with mechanical precision, while their eyes stared into some distant horror that only they could see. The medical consequences of these arrangements soon became apparent. Palace physicians were summoned repeatedly to treat conditions that the surviving medical papyri describe in euphemistic language, but their meaning is clear enough to modern understanding. These young women were suffering physical trauma that reflected the unnatural nature of their relationships. The tragedy reached its most horrific crescendo when Akhenaten died. The official records speak vaguely of illness, perhaps a plague that was sweeping through the region. But the artistic evidence tells a different, far more devastating story. Reliefs carved in the royal tomb show scenes of intense mourning. We see the royal family weeping, their grief raw and unstylized. But look at the center of the scene. We see a young woman lying on what appears to be a birthing bed. She is attended by midwives. Nearby, a wet nurse holds a newborn infant. The implications of this imagery are inescapable. Akhenaten died in childbirth. And given the isolation of the royal family, given the elevation of her status, the father of that child was almost certainly Akhenaten himself. The girl who should have been playing with dolls, who should have been learning the arts appropriate to a princess, had instead died bringing her father's offspring into a world that offered no hope of normalcy. The death of Akhenaten sent shockwaves through what remained of the royal court. Even the most fanatical supporters of Akhenaten's religious revolution found themselves questioning a system that could produce such monstrous results. Whispered conversations in palace corridors spoke of divine judgment, of cosmic retribution for violations so profound that they had disrupted the very order of creation. But rather than recognizing the horror of what he had done, Akhenaten responded to his daughter's death with even more desperate measures. His need for male heirs to continue his revolutionary dynasty had become an obsession that consumed whatever remained of his humanity. The surviving daughters watched their sister's funeral preparations with the terrible knowledge that her death had not ended their nightmare. It had only intensified their father's determination. The youngest of the older trio, Akhenaten, now found herself in the crosshairs. This child, whose name meant she lives for Ammonius, before she was forced to change it to Akhenaten, she lives for the Aten, would indeed live for her father's god in ways that represented the ultimate perversion of devotion. She watched Akhenaten die. She saw what the honor of being her father's wife brought. And now, the eyes of the pharaoh turned to her. Palace records from this period paint a picture of a court where normal human relationships had completely broken down. Servants were afraid to look directly at the royal family, not out of traditional respect, but because the sight of what these young women had become was too disturbing to bear. Foreign ambassadors sent reports home describing a pharaoh who had clearly lost his mind, and a royal household that had descended into a hell of his own making. The psychological damage extended beyond the immediate victims to encompass the entire royal household. The remaining daughters Neferneferutin Tasheret, Neferneferur, and Setapenra were still children. Akhenaten had stood. She wore the robes Akhenaten had worn. And soon, she too bore a child. Archaeologists have found references to a king's daughter born of the king's daughter. The phrasing is convoluted, a riddle in stone, but the implication is sickeningly clear. Akhenaten had fathered a child with his own 12-year-old daughter. He was trying to create a pure line, a solar dynasty distilled through incest, believing that by concentrating the royal blood, he was concentrating the power of the sun itself. But while the pharaoh played God in his harem, the world outside was burning. We must look away from the suffocating luxury of the palace for a moment to understand the sheer scale of the disaster unfolding on Egypt's borders. While Akhenaten was obsessing over the angle of the sun rays in a temple relief, the Egyptian empire was being dismantled, piece by piece. In the archives of Amarna, beneath the sand, peasant women found clay tablets in the late 19th century. These are the famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from kings and governors across the ancient world. They are not hymns of praise. They are desperate, frantic pleas for help. Ribhata, the loyal governor of Byblos, wrote to Akhenaten dozens of times. His letters are heartbreaking. Why do you hold your peace? The dogs are tearing at the gates. Send archers. Send gold. Send anything. If you do not act, I am a dead man. To the north, a new predator had awakened, the Hittites, led by the ruthless king Suppiluliuma. They sensed the vacuum in Egypt. They saw a pharaoh who had turned his back on war, on diplomacy, on reality. They swept down through Syria, devouring Egyptian vassal states one by one. Akhenaten did not answer the letters. He did not send the armies. He was too busy composing poetry to the Aten, too busy impregnating his daughters, too busy building a utopia that was rapidly becoming a graveyard. The economic consequences were catastrophic. The trade routes that brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cedar from Lebanon were severed. The gold that fueled the empire stopped flowing. In the markets of Amarna, prices soared. The common people, who had been forced to move to this desert capital, began to starve. Excavations in the commoners' cemeteries at Amarna reveal a population living on the brink of collapse. The bones of the workers show signs of severe malnutrition, spinal trauma from carrying heavy loads, and anemia. While the royal family feasted on roast duck and wine in the cool gardens of the palace, the people building their paradise were dying of hunger and overwork. And then came the plague. It is the great irony of Akhenaten's reign. He outlawed the old god Sekhmet, the goddess of healing, Osiris, the god of the dead. He claimed the Aten was the sole provider of life. But the Aten could not stop the bacteria that arrived on the trade ships from the Levant. A pandemic, likely influenza or the bubonic plague, swept through the ancient Near East. It hit Amarna with the force of a sledgehammer. The crowded, hastily built city was a breeding ground for disease. The plague did not care about royal blood. It breached the palace walls. We see the evidence in the sudden disappearances. The queen mother, Tai, a formidable woman who had tried to keep her son grounded, vanishes. Kia, a secondary wife whom Akhenaten had reportedly loved, disappears. And then, the younger daughters began to fall. This brings us to the final, most pathetic chapter of the family tragedy, the fate of the youngest princesses. Nefer-Neferutin Tasharet. Nefer-Neferur. Seta-Penra. These were little girls. Seta-Penra was barely 6 years old. We have depictions of them playing, holding gazelles, sitting on cushions. They were the innocent bystanders of their father's revolution. As the plague raged and the dynastic obsession deepened, Akhenaten's gaze shifted even to them. There is evidence hotly debated, but terrifyingly plausible, that as the older daughters failed to produce a male heir, or died, or grew too old, the king turned to the younger ones. The psychological atmosphere in the palace during these final years must have been comparable to a doomsday cult. The leader is losing his grip on reality. The outside world is closing in. The prophecy is failing. Akhenaten began to see enemies everywhere. The priesthood of Ammonius, though officially disbanded, was still powerful in the shadows. They whispered that the plague was a punishment. They said the sun had turned its face away because the pharaoh had forgotten the balance of Ma'at. To counter this, Akhenaten became even more extreme. He ordered the name of Ammonius to be chiseled off not just temple walls, but off small personal items, cosmetic jars, spoons, even the tips of obelisks towering hundreds of feet in the air. It was a mania. He was trying to edit reality with a chisel. And in the center of this swirling madness sat Akhenaten. She was the survivor. She had watched her mother vanish, her sisters die, and her father descend into lunacy. She was the last vessel of the royal blood. By the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten was a broken man. The art from the very end of the period shows a pharaoh who looks aged beyond his years, haggard, with a face that seems to sag under the weight of his own failures. The sun was setting on the horizon of the Aten. When death finally came for the heretic king, it was not with a bang, but with a whimper. He died alone in his desert city, surrounded by the ruins of his dream. There were no great processions of weeping subjects, for his subjects hated him. There were no elaborate rituals from the Book of the Dead to guide him to the afterlife, for he had burned the books. He was buried in the royal tomb in the eastern cliffs, in a sarcophagus carved from red granite. But he would not rest there. The moment the king's heart stopped, the machinery of the state seized up. The vacuum he left was instant and terrifying. Who would rule? He had no living son, at least, none that he had acknowledged as his heir. He had only the daughters he had abused and the wife he had erased. What happened next is one of the great mysteries of Egyptology. A shadowy figure named Smenkhare appears briefly on the throne. Was this a younger brother? A son? Or was it, as many modern historians believe, Nefertiti herself, returned from exile to try and salvage the wreckage of the dynasty? Or perhaps it was Meritaten, the eldest daughter, forced to wear the false beard of kingship and rule over a city that was already dying. Whoever this ruler was, their reign was short. The center could not hold. Out of the shadows emerged a boy. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old. His name was Akhenaten. He was likely the son of Akhenaten, born of a minor wife or perhaps even one of his own sisters. The genetic testing is messy, a map of incestuous tangents. And standing beside him was the only person who could legitimize his rule, Akhenaten. The victimized daughter was now the queen of Egypt. She married her half-brother, the boy king. Together, 2 traumatized children were placed on the golden throne of the greatest empire on earth and told to fix the world. Their first act was one of survival. They abandoned Amarna. Imagine that exodus. The royal barge pushing off from the quay, turning its bow back toward Thebes, back toward the old gods. Behind them, the city of Akhenaten was left to the desert. The palaces where the princesses had been tormented, the temples where the gold had shone so brightly, the broad avenues where the chariots had raced, all of it was abandoned. The priests of Ammonius returned with a vengeance. They did not just want to forget Akhenaten, they wanted to kill his soul. They entered the city he had built. They smashed the statues. They gouged out his eyes in the reliefs so he could not see the afterlife. They hacked away his name so the gods could not call him. They took the stones of his temples and used them as fill for their own pylons, literally burying his heresy inside the walls of orthodoxy. Akhenaten, now back in Thebes, changed her name. She was no longer living for the Aten. She was living for Ammonius. She tried to wash away the sins of her father. But the trauma does not wash away so easily. She and Tutankhamun lived in a court filled with sharks. The old advisors, Ai and Hormheb, hovered behind the thronemen who had served Akhenaten but now claimed they had only been following orders. They watched the young couple with predatory eyes. The tragedy of Akhenaten is that she tried, desperately, to have a family of her own. She wanted to create life that wasn't born of perversion. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, there was a small, undecorated box. Inside were two tiny coffins. They contained the mummified remains of two stillborn daughters. The medical analysis of these tiny bodies is heartbreaking. They show severe genetic defects, spina bifida, scoliosis, deformities of the skeletal structure. The legacy of Akhenaten's incestuous breeding program had followed Akhenaten into her marriage. She could not produce a viable heir. Her father's blood was too thick, too cursed. When Tutankhamun died suddenly at the age of 19, perhaps from an infection, perhaps from a fall, or perhaps from a blow to the head, Akhenaten was left entirely alone. She was the last of the Amarna bloodline. She was the last survivor of the House of Horrors. And she knew, with the instinct of a woman who had survived a mad father, that her time was running out. The vultures were circling. Her grandfather, the Vizier Ai, wanted the throne. To get it, he needed to marry her. He wanted to force her into a marriage with a man 40 years her senior, a man who had stood by and watched her father abuse her sisters. Akhenaten did something extraordinary. She broke the ultimate taboo. She wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's greatest enemy. This letter, found in the Hittite archives, is the voice of a woman on the edge of the abyss. My husband is dead and I have no son. They say you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not wish to take one of my subjects as a husband. I am afraid. I am afraid. Those three words echo across 3,000 years. The Queen of Egypt, the daughter of the Sun King, confessing her terror to a foreign enemy. She was begging for a savior to rescue her from her own court. The Hittite king was suspicious, but eventually, he sent a son, Prince Zenanza. But Zenanza never arrived. He was assassinated on the border of Egypt, murdered, almost certainly, by the agents of Ai or Hormheb. The trap snapped shut. Akhenaten disappears from history shortly after. We see her name on a few rings, a few pendants, married to King Ai. And then, nothing. Did he kill her? Did she take her own life? Did she die of a broken heart, finally crushed by the weight of the memories she carried? We do not know. Her tomb has never been identified. Her mummy has never been conclusively found. She simply dissolved into the sand, another victim of the Amarna tragedy. Today, when you walk the ruins of Amarna, you are walking through the wreckage of a family. The wind blows through the empty window frames of the northern palace, where the daughters were kept. You can see the remnants of the painted pavement, ducks flying through reeds, calves jumping in the grass, scenes of nature that belie the unnatural horrors that took place above them. Akhenaten wanted to be remembered as the great visionary, the man who found the one true God. Instead, he is remembered as the man who broke his family to pieces. But the story isn't just about the dead. It is about the silence they left behind. The erasure was almost successful. For thousands of years, no one knew Akhenaten existed. He was a ghost, a gap in the king lists. It wasn't until the modern era that we pieced together the fragments of his crime. We found the smashed statues. We found the desperate letters. We found the tiny coffins. And we found the truth. This was not a golden age. It was a gilded cage. And inside that cage, 6 princesses were forced to play a game they could never win. The desert sun still beats down on Amarna. It is the same sun they worshipped. It is the same sun that watched them die. And if you listen closely to the wind howling through the broken walls, you can almost hear them. Not the prayers of the high priest, but the whispers of the daughters. The lost daughters of Amarna. The dynasty ended in blood and silence. But the scars of Amarna would haunt Egypt for generations. The generals who took power Ramesses would build a new Egypt, one of iron and stone, determined to ensure that a king like Akhenaten could never rise again. Yet, buried deep in the Valley of the Kings, one secret remained. A tomb so small, so hidden, that the robbers missed it. A tomb that would one day speak for the silenced children of the heretic. This is the legacy of the Sun King. A legacy not of light, but of an everlasting shadow.